So we're getting into the meat of this program now, and it's kind of interesting stuff, I think. And now I want to tell you a little story about how I came to get interested in this process that we're going to start discussing. Back in 1989 or thereabouts, I stopped drinking. I had consumed my share of alcohol, and so it was time to quit. And was kind of investigating the recovery programs that were out there at the time, and at the same time, I had been interested in Zen starting in the 70s, but had really had a formal practice because there wasn't any place to practice formally. And but the little group had started in Orlando, following Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition. And so I started sitting with them. So I was practicing meditation, and I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh, and he didn't have a whole lot of books in English at that point. And pretty much it was mindfulness, 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 which was good. But I was really kind of a mess. I had done some fairly serious damage to my psyche by that point. And so I was struggling. And I encountered a new program called Rational Recovery that had been started in California by a licensed clinical social worker who had studied rational-emotive behavior therapy with Albert Ellis. And he had started this recovery program that used that as a process. So I was sitting with the Thich Nhat Hanh group, and I was trying to reread all of my Zen stuff, and I was going to these rational recovery meetings. And one day I'm sitting in a rational recovery meeting, and we had a mentor who had agreed to work with us. And this was a psychologist named Dr. Philip Tate. And Philip was sitting at the table, and a bunch of us sitting around, and this young woman had started talking about the issues she was having with, well, you name it, she was struggling with it. She was dealing with the aftermath of alcohol dependency and drug dependency, and she had an eating disorder and exercise bulimia and relationship problems and all this stuff. And so she was talking about this thing that had happened. And so Philip just kind of finally stopped her. And he just said, he questioned her about something she had said and how she felt. And he said, why do you think you feel this way? And she said, well, I think I need better self-esteem. And he said, very matter-of-factly, self-esteem is a sickness. Well, that just kind of stopped me in my tracks, like, wow. It was like a Zen koan. It's like the sky opened up. Because there's all this stuff in Zen about the self and transcending the self and all these things that you read about in Buddhism, about the self and the not-self characteristic and all these things. And I've been trying to understand those, but I didn't really get what that had to do with stress and suffering, with how bad I felt at that point. And as he goes on to explain that self-esteem means that we believe that we have a self and that it's rateable, and that's how we create a lot of suffering for ourselves. It's like, oh, I get this now. And it seemed very strongly connected to a lot of what I was reading about in Buddhism at the time. So I started reading Albert Ellis stuff, and I started working a whole lot with REBT, and I ended up being one of the first rational recovery coordinators. There's no longer a rational recovery, there's no longer any rational recovery coordinators, but I got a lot out of that experience and working with this material, primarily with people who had stopped drinking or stopped using drugs and that sort of thing. And we're trying to deal with the stresses and problems that came about after that. So a little bit about Ellis and the Buddha and how compatible these processes are. And we're going to talk about some things that come out of psychotherapy. but we're going to use them as tools for spiritual practice. We're not doing psychotherapy here. We're using REBT really to kind of understand and bring down to earth the way the teachings of the Buddha can help us stop the cycle of day-to-day stress and suffering. So it's something new to add to your spiritual toolbox would be a good way to look at this. So 500 BCE or thereabouts, the Buddha sat down under a tree, meditated for several days, got up, and started teaching that there is suffering, that there's a cause for suffering. The cause for suffering is your mind's engagement with what happens to you. And the path to transcend that really is a process of changing the way your mind, your emotions, and your behaviors interact. So he specifically attributed suffering to some activities that are largely cognitive in nature. And in Buddhism, we call those things ignorance. So in the 1950s, along comes Albert Ellis. And Ellis says pretty much the same thing, but instead of talking about ignorance, he talks about irrationality. So irrationality and irrational beliefs very much equate to the Buddha's idea of ignorance and delusion. So in REBT, we change emotions, but largely by changing our cognitions. It's not a simple cause and effect. Actions, emotions, and thoughts really kind of cycle around one another. It's not as simple as ABC, although I'm going to present it to you in an ABC fashion, right? But basically, Buddhism is considered a triple training. There's sila, samadhi, panya. Sila is basically compassionate action. You train in action. Samadhi is kind of purifying your mind. And panya is coming up with right views. So it's working with behaviors, emotions, cognitions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Mm-hmm. And rationality, rational-emotive behavior therapy, REBT, does very much the same thing. Changes your behavior, changes your emotions, works with your cognitions. And the simplest way, not necessarily the easiest way to approach this, is to look at the way the cognitions get involved in the process of creating suffering. So, most of the time you go to a meditation retreat at a Buddhist temple or something like that, you're working almost 100% with the emotional side of things. You're working in very emotive ways. Mindfulness practice and that kind of stuff works fairly directly with your emotions, and that's good. But you got to have the cognitive and behavioral side too. So we're going to focus here on the cognitive side. And as we do that, as you practice and take away what you hear here, you'll engage that with some behavioral and emotional changes. So this makes studying Dharma a lot more real life, because you can start to see how your views affect the way you feel and what you do. So I'm going to talk about a real traditional Buddhist thing for a minute, and then we'll kind of bring the 20th century to that. And I know it's the 21st century, but this comes out of the 20th. So the Buddha explained how the cycle of stress and suffering originates through this fairly complex teaching called dependent origination. And those of you who have the workbook, there's a graphic in there that kind of shows how this cycle works. To shortcut it, we carry into existence consciousness. Some of our consciousness contains some ideas, some views, some ways of reacting to things. Some of those ideas, views, beliefs, and so on are pretty rational. Some of them are pretty not rational. Okay, some of them are ignorance-based. So with ignorance as a condition, there is consciousness, and with consciousness as a condition, there's us. I'm creating some shortcuts here. If you want to see the long version of it, download the workbook and you can see that. And so I am in this moment subject to some causes and conditions which include some ideas that are not very well grounded in reality. Right? So, and because of that, my reactions to some things are going to not be very skillful. Skillful is the Buddhist word we use. You could also say kind of mentally unhealthy. So, Ellis recognized this too in the 1950s, and he said the way people react to stuff sometimes is based on some fairly, what he called fairly crazy ideas. So let me give you an example. Say you're driving down the road, and somebody pulls out in traffic and cuts you off, and you almost have to run off the road to avoid them. The mind immediately comes up for explanations for all of this. But basically what happens is you have a physical response, and you have a lot of thoughts, and then the mind kind of creates an emotional explanation for how you're feeling. Okay? And so you start attaching your views to this, like other people should drive more safely, and people who don't drive safely are bad and they should be punished, and so you end up flipping them off, all right? Or you end up with full-blown road rage or something like that. So these ideas that other people should drive more safely, and that if they don't, they're bad people, that's an example of kind of a crazy idea. Now, it doesn't sound that crazy till you start to break it down. You go, well, other people drive the way they drive, which includes, since the other people are human beings and not perfect and not, like Google automatic, driverless cars or whatever, includes the ability to make mistakes and to do some things that are kind of dumb sometimes. And I've done dumb things while driving too, and I don't know that I've ever run anybody off the road, but maybe I did and just wasn't paying attention or whatever, and didn't notice it. You never know, because I know I've made mistakes as a driver, and I've done things that have been inconvenience to other people, but I don't think I'm a bad person. So at that moment, while you're driving, and you've got your middle finger sticking out the window, you're thinking this is an evil person that you're flipping off, right? It really might be somebody's grandma, okay? So this is kind of the way we sort of approach this. Then we look at the emotions and behaviors that we would say are unskillful. They defeat us. We want happiness. We want a certain amount of safety and security and freedom from stress and suffering. And then because we have these ideas that are not really fairly well grounded in reality, we create stress and suffering and unsafety for ourselves. So what do we do about this? Well, we go find ways to determine what those ideas are and to work at changing them. And so Ellis came along with this ABC process that we're going to start learning how to apply to Buddhism. So at A, you have an activating event of some sort, or an adversity. And then at B, you have some beliefs about that event. And that's going to include some rational beliefs as well as some irrational beliefs. And then at C, you have a consequence of that, which includes emotions and behaviors. It's the emotional and behavioral reaction really to your beliefs. We tend to think, if somebody says, oh, I'm so mad, and I say, why are you so mad? I'm mad because so-and-so did such and such. You're not really mad because somebody did something. You're mad because of what you think about what someone did. Does that make sense? They might legitimately have inconvenienced you in some huge way or done something that was unethical or whatever. But you're not mad because they did it. You're mad because of how you interpreted what they did. So I've given you a handout that's got that ABC process, and I've filled in one side. And this is based on something that really happened to me. So I'm going to kind of walk you through that from a personal perspective and then give you an opportunity to think about how to apply this to yourself. So several years ago, I got this dog, Faust. Got Faust in 2003 or so, so he's kind of old now. But when he was a little younger, he used to want to go for a walk every day, and we'd go to different parks and trails near the, in West Volusia County and walk, and he loved that. But there was this one fella that we would frequently encounter walking with 3 dogs, 2 fairly large boxers, and then this small, I don't know, one of those little yappy dogs. I don't know what kind of dogs. And he didn't believe in leashes. So I'd be walking Faust on his leash the way I'm supposed to, the way the law says you're supposed to. And this guy's dogs would come running up on us, and they would go after Faust. And then he'd come running up and yelling and screaming, and they would be completely ignoring him, and he'd have to grab him and pull him back and everything. And he'd say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, this usually isn't a problem." Well, the 3rd time this happened, I said, "That's what you said the last 2 times this happened, that it was a problem." And I said, "You really need to start keeping your dogs leashed." "I know." Well, then the 6th time this happened, I started getting kind of annoyed with him, and I said, "Look, it's the law, you got to keep your dogs leashed." And now I'm getting mad. And then I started working for the county, opening and closing the park, and now he is openly defying me, right? So I would get really angry about this, and to the point where I would steam about it for a while afterward. And then finally I said, "Wait a minute. Let me look at what I'm thinking about this guy." So the activating event is there's a guy walking his dogs without leashes, and when I come on him, his dogs are aggressive toward mine, and then he makes excuses. So beliefs about that are things like dog owners should be responsible. Dog owners should obey the law. If someone doesn't obey the law, they're bad. Because that's what I'm thinking about this guy. I'm having, ideas about what I should do to it, how he should be punished and all these kinds of things, right? He's bad. And because of those beliefs, now I'm getting anger. I'm getting these kind of thoughts about retaliation, and I'm yelling at the guy when I see him and stuff like this. Even fantasizing about kicking his butt. Mm-hmm. Okay, because he deserves that, right? He's a bad guy.
Mm-hmm. Totally. You're right.
So then I look at this and I go, okay, he's really obviously, yes, it would be strongly preferable for all dog owners to be responsible people. And it would definitely improve my situation, be less inconvenient to me if he would use a leash. But that doesn't mean he should. Because he comes into this moment carrying a certain, based on the causes and conditions that led him here, including probably the idea that he's being extra nice to his dogs by allowing them freedom. So he likes dogs. Anybody who likes dogs can't be all bad. I like dogs, right? So by going through this process and seeing that, again, he's wrong, and what he's doing is not considerate and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't make him bad. And in fact, he's probably reacting from the same kinds of irrational ideas that I am. So he's a lot like me. So now, I still don't like what he does. It's still not the right thing to do, but I don't have to get mad at him anymore. And I don't have to obsess over it. I don't waste, the next 45 minutes of time that I'm spending walking my dog out in this beautiful park, where I could be having a really good time, instead ruminating about what a jerk this guy is. Okay. So this is kind of how this process works. You look and find what are the ideas that are creating anger? What are the ideas that are creating anxiety? What are the ideas that are creating depression and hopelessness and all of these kinds of things? And you go, okay, now let me see, do these things fit in with the world as it really is? And if not, you challenge them and change them. Now, this doesn't mean that as soon as you've found an irrational belief and recognize it as irrational, that you're not going to react to something with anger or anxiety or whatever. Because those things kind of arise. We don't have a self that we control. We have a self that we can influence strongly. But we're not in control of what comes up. So things are going to come up. We'll apply cognitive explanations for these things that come up sometimes. But when we start to change the explanations, then over time, we change what comes up. Does that make sense?
Say it one more time, the very last part.
Emotions are going to arise. Okay, and like I said earlier, emotions really are kind of physical sensations sometimes, and we start explaining why they're there. And as we change the explanations, we will often change what arises, or at least the strength at which it arises, or how long we hold on to it. Does that make sense now?
The self-talk.
Yes. Yeah, anger comes up, and you can either nurse it by continuing to feed it, by coming up with a whole lot more irrational reasons why you're justified in feeling it, or you can go, oh, anger has arisen, and now I see how kind of fruitless that is, and you can start focusing on some rational ideas, rational beliefs, and then the anger is going to subside. And the more you practice with that, the quicker that anger is going to go away, and sometimes it won't arise anymore in the same circumstance. Also, again, not every irrational belief leads to an unpleasant emotion. Not every rational belief leads to a pleasant emotion. If I said I prefer that other dog owners are responsible, and I encounter an irresponsible dog owner, I'm still going to prefer that that person not be irresponsible. But the emotional reaction to a preference versus the emotional reaction to a demand are very different. If you said, well, I'd rather have chocolate cake, and you get vanilla cake, okay. If you said, no, it's my birthday and I must have chocolate cake, and you get vanilla cake, it's a very different response, right? So that's a simplified explanation of this, but basically a lot of this is a matter of you're attracted to something and you cling to it, or you're attracted to something, you can let it go, right? So these irrational beliefs, or what the Buddha would refer to as ignorance, are really very clinging oriented. So when you change the ideal, you change the amount of clinging involved.